My relationship with Warcraft has been nearly 2 decades of yo-yoing between love and hate, but I wouldn't spend this much energy on something I didn't care deeply about, so let's jump right into this horrific goulash of unrealistic ideas and wishes, shall we? I'll be splitting this into multiple videos covering the preliminary narrative, zones, and finally the endgame and the aftermath. And no, despite the subtitle, this will not actually be all that perfect. I will miss things or make decisions others might not agree with, and my knowledge of the lore is not encyclopedic, but you know what? Neither is the dev team, so it all boils down to personal taste, doesn't it? This will not be a total replacement of the Burning Crusade, but a retelling, say if it were made today, and with a team willing to look directly at the messy and uncomfortable parts of their setting, and try to do something meaningful with it rather than continually walk into very avoidable rakes. That being said, I am just one well-meaning idiot, so we'll see which rake I step on, won't we? On with the video. Just as the Burning Crusade started, we begin with the Dark Portal reopening and spitting out an obscene amount of demons, so the Horde and Alliance agree to work together to figure out what the hell is going on and put an end to it. In this version, however, the might of Kalimdor is used as a foundation to this joint effort. After all, if an army made up mostly of orcs and night elves managed to cooperate long enough and well enough to push back an otherwise insurmountable enemy in Silithus, the rest of the Horde and Alliance should be able to do the same thing in the face of another invasion by the Burning Legion, just like they did in the Third War. While the Horde and Alliance hold a very tense line, a team pushes through to the other side to create a beachhead made up of people who have a vested interest in discovering what's going on in Outland, and yes, I have just ripped off the intro to Warlords of Draenor, because that expansion isn't going to happen at all the way it does in canon, if I survive the process of making these videos long enough to reach it, God help me. The team includes Verisa Windrunner and Dark Ranger Laurelin, who are both looking for signs of Ilaria Windrunner, with Laurelin reporting everything they find back to Sylvanas, naturally. Tyrion Fordring, who wants to find old friends from the original expedition and help them if he can after breaking out of his depression exile in the Plaguelands. Varrock Sorfang, who hopes to find any trace of the original orcs who weren't drawn into Gul'dan and Ner'zhul's horrific plans and will report back to Thrall if he does. Lady Liadrin, who in this version of events is here to find out why they've suddenly lost contact with Kael'thas and his contingent. Warden Amberlance, a hooded night elf looking for Maiev Shadowsong. And Vindicator Yrel, plucked from Warlords in the atrocious character assassination that was the Mag'har intro. She's now an older, scarred paladin who was born on Draenor. This team successfully takes back the Stair of Destiny, creating a forward camp in order to operate further missions, which allows the Might of Kalimdor to start pushing through and reinforce that forward camp. There are varying degrees of friction between some of the members of the team, specifically Yrel and Liadrin, with their differing approaches to the light. Yrel lost her faith and found a reason to believe again and received the light's help, whereas Liadrin lost her faith and went on to force the light to help. There is also a discomforting tension between Yrel and Saurfang, as Yrel survived the Draenei genocide and Saurfang took part in it. This doesn't express itself in obvious overt comments or arguments, but a sense of deep unease when they're around each other, as neither of them want to touch that conversation. Verisa and Laurelin butt heads, but it's largely one-sided as Verisa grapples with having known Laurelin before the fall of Quel'Thalas, and reconciling that with who and what Laurelin is now, like a trial run of her reuniting with Sylvanas later, which Laurelin will needle her about because what exactly has been stopping her from reaching out all these years. Meanwhile, Tyrion and Amberlance are too focused on their respective missions to engage. But before we get any further into Outland, let's rewind a hot second to cover the situation with the Blood Elves and Draenei leading up to now, shall we? For those who forgot or didn't know, Draenei weren't meant to be pretty space goats. When we met them in the Frozen Throne expansion of Warcraft 3, they looked exactly like what we now call the Broken and Lost Ones. However, I do like the Draenei and their connection to the Burning Legion, so we get both as a playable race. Now, with various pieces of important information and lore added years after the point it would have been relevant or useful to actually have in-game, originally Tempest Keep was sent by the Army of the Light along with the Naru, Adal, Muro, and Oros to aid Valen and Khadgar against the demonic forces amassing in Outland. For our purposes, Tempest Keep was a remote research and development hub with a heavy military focus. The Draenei were a peaceful people, but they weren't foolish enough to think that the Burning Legion wouldn't come looking for them. When Draenor shattered, a large portion of the population hid inside the shielded walls of the keep, protecting them from the detrimental effects that resulted in broken and lost ones. They remained inside for years, supported by the flora and fauna of the Botanica, until Kael'thas attacked the keep as he did in canon. In a rush to escape, Muro was captured along with many Draenei, but most of them made it to the Exodar and escaped to Azeroth, crash landing 6 months before the Dark Portal opens. Muro is still sent back to Silvermoon to be bound and siphoned by the elves to create Blood Knights, paladins who forcefully wield the light rather than receive it. From here, Draenei start on Azure Mist, which goes more or less the same as it does in-game, where they get themselves organised, try to heal the environmental damage their crash caused, and run into a Night Elf who mistakes them for Eredar like Archimonde. Meanwhile, playable Broken start in Outland as Illidari servants in a sharded version of Shadowmoon Valley. This introduction gives insight into what's going on behind the massive black gate that now seals the valley, not unlike Tanaan Jungle in Warlords, before the rest of the story happens, showing Illidan's descent into panicked tyranny. After his defeat by Arthas and his failure to destroy the Frozen Throne, Illidan has become increasingly paranoid of Kil'jaeden's agents everywhere. He's run out of anything that he could do to win back favour or appease the Legion to buy time, so he is frantically running roughshod over all of Outland in an effort to build up sufficient forces against it, and he does not care who he has to crush or what he has to do in service to that. However, in so doing, he's driven a wedge between himself and his allies, most notable of which is Kael'thas, while the people of Outland are fracturing under the pressure, the Broken most of all. You start off running errands for Akama in Black Temple, witnessing the way a once holy site has been taken over by corruption, filled with demons and fell orcs. Illidan is creating them in a complex deep beneath the temple where they used to inter the dead, where the Pit Lord Magtheridon bellows and struggles to be free. Originally, Magtheridon was dragged all the way over to Hellfire Peninsula to be milked for extra fell orcs, but we're replacing him with in the next video. You overhear an exchange between Magtheridon and Illidan that sheds light on the situation with Kael'thas. The Pit Lord spits at Illidan and taunts him with the fact that even his allies have seen the futility of fighting against the Legion, but if Illidan had just shown Kael'thas how to properly sate his people's thirst for magic, the prince wouldn't have been so amenable to Kil'jaeden's offer. All he wanted was salvation for his people, but your pride and fear wouldn't allow it. You drove him away all on your own. You're good at that, aren't you, little elf? Enraged, Illidan sends you away to the sound of Magtheridon howling in agony. In canon, Kael'thas did turn against Illidan and join the Burning Legion, but we're going to expand on it a bit later. The few bright spots of the Broken intro comprise of Akama, the player's tribe, and a Blood Elf demon hunter by the name of Valra Blackspear, who is kinder to them than most of her kin. She sneaks extra food and medicine to your group and speaks often with Akama and another demon hunter, Altruis, who is displeased with the direction Illidan is taking them. He blames Illidan for the chaos unfolding in the rest of Outland, Kael'thas turning on them, and the arrival of the Horde and Alliance. It never should have gotten this far, but their great lord is trapped by tunnel vision and fear. Eventually, while running an errand to the Warden's cage, you happen upon Akama talking to Maiev Shadowsong, clearly scheming, but you're surrounded by Illidan's cruelties against your people, so you conspire with Akama and Maiev and the two demon hunters that are chafing under his rule. This involves running interference, disrupting operations, carefully finding others who believe that Illidan might not be fit to lead, and part of this involves working with the Netherwing dragons, who are naturally not remotely happy with the dragon more subjugating them. Sidebar, I'd love a little nothing side quest separate from that where you find an injured hatchling and nurse it back to health, and you get an adorable baby Netherwing pet out of it. It'd provide a nice breather from the tension and bleakness of this intro. This activity eventually leads to a broken rebellion in Shadowmoon, which is brutally stamped out by Illidan's fell orcs, but not before Valra opens a portal to let a significant number of Broken escape to Bloodmist Isle, including the player. The last thing you see is a furious Illidan descending on Valra. From Bloodmist Isle, there's a short quest chain where initial confusion from the Draenei leads to a meeting with Valen, who welcomes you and your fellow survivors into the fold. You then proceed with the quests on Bloodmist Isle as intended, and the Broken racial mount can be a Talbuk. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Kingdoms, the Blood Elves, having fought to regain control of Northern Eversong and claw back their city, are convinced by Sylvanas to compromise with the Amani and work together to take back the rest of their lost lands. In-game, of course, the Amani are treated as quest and raid fodder, hyper-aggressive so-called savages to be massacred, despite the fact that they have very good reasons to be pissed off and hate the elves, you know, colonization and all that. Sylvanas' logic is that they don't have the luxury of fighting on two fronts, not with the Alliance breathing down their necks in search of weaknesses. They must do whatever it takes to survive, as she has in aligning with the Horde, something she never would have considered in life under normal circumstances. Most of their lands are desecrated, their population was reduced by 90%, their prince is in the wind, and the Alliance that abandoned, imprisoned, and threatened to finish the atrocity that Arthur started is sniffing around their territory. This is hardly what one might call normal circumstances. They must swallow their pride and do what it takes to survive. Now, in-game, when you start out, there's much reverence for the prince in his so-called promised land beyond the Dark Portal. The ever-present arcane thirst looms over everything and is made manifest in the wretched elves who have lost control of their hunger and are reduced to half-feral shadows of their former selves. In this intro, there's a sense of unease regarding their future as they lost contact with the prince 6 months ago. There would be a more overt spurning of the light as something to rely on and have faith in, the elves as a whole embracing the Blood Knight view that the light is something that needs to be brought to heel and controlled because it's utterly unreliable otherwise. Where was the light when Arthas came, after all? A small side quest chain can focus on worshippers of Belore, the elven face of Anshe, the sun god. While the majority of Quel'Darai believed in the light, sun worship lingered in their lexicon and their cultural motifs, and this quest chain would plant seeds for a later revival of that practice. In Silvermoon you'd see not just the Horde ambassadors but also diplomats from Zul'Aman, and at the end of the Eversong quest chain you would report to Lor'themar about your success and witness a conversation between him and Sylvanas. He shows reservations regarding the ongoing truce between them and the Imani, and Sylvanas again presses the importance of doing what it takes to survive. Emotes and dialogue window description would make it clear that Sylvanas is uncomfortable being in her homelands, and if the player hangs around they would see a brief exchange where Lor'themar brings up plans for a ceremony to honour and remember the dead, something that seems to unsettle Sylvanas and results in her shutting the conversation down. The cooperation and willingness to do the work to move forward results in at least half of the Ghostlands being considered Imani territory, and Imani troll players begin within an expanded version of Zul'Aman. Their intro would provide a much more openly sympathetic view of the Imani, showing them as communities, friends, and family instead of, raid fodder. We'd explore their lower, Akelzon, Halazi, Janalai, and Nalarak through an early part of the quest chain and how they factor into Imani lives. Outside the political tension, there would be threats to take care of concerning encroaching undead and a spreading sickness caused by Scourge-aligned parties. To that end, a part of the Ghostland story would touch on what Arthas' attack on Quel'Tha last looked like from an Imani perspective, since, oh look, the people who constantly pushed us out of our lands, built their city on a sacred area, and treated us like animals had their home invaded and were nearly wiped out. That's interesting. Your role in all this, of course, is to hunt down those responsible, and along the way you would see elven diplomats in Zul'Aman, and a number of quests would focus on making sure that no one makes the situation worse. The Imani were not spared the consequences of your next-door neighbour being flooded with ravenous hordes of undead, so they're in a dubious position and cannot afford to risk an all-out war now that the Blood Elves are on their feet again and have the support of the Forsaken. Another sidebar, in the Ghostlands you'll still see a huge Forsaken presence providing the bulk of the fighting forces to push out the Scourge, but they're so dug in and supplied with extra bodies from the Plaguelands that in this version it requires the extra force applied by the Imani to rout them. There'd be focus paid to Zul'Jin's justified rage against the elves, and we'd get a scene where Malakras suggests it isn't too late to enact his plan. They can bind their gods the way the elves have bound the light and empower their strongest warriors to wipe out the elves for good, as they try to do in the raid. Zul'Jin takes a moment to look out over Zul'Aman at his people going about their lives, and he ultimately rejects the plan to desecrate their Loa, telling Malakras that he won't destroy what they are for a chance, and not a guaranteed one at that, to satisfy a hatred that hasn't been sated in thousands of years of conflict. They already tried to finish the elves off at their supposed weakest, when their kingdom was in utter ruin and they were pinned in a corner at Quel'Danas, and still the elves persisted. He won't risk the Imani in a war, but he vows under no uncertain terms is he going to let the elves forget what they've done. And so, at the end of the introductory quest chain for Imani players, Lor'themar formally acknowledges the blood and suffering enacted against the Imani during an intense meeting with Zul'Jin. It would be very uncomfortable considering Zul'Jin personally tortured Lor'themar and got tortured by Haldoran in retaliation, on top of everything else that's happened to their people, but the cycle only ends when they choose to end it. They've been going at each other for thousands of years now, and if they keep going, it could continue for 1,000 more. There's been enough blood, enough misery, enough broken families and trading scars. They need to find another way. Would this ever happen in current WoW? No, of course not, after the travesty that was exploring Kalimdor. Are you high? Someone much more knowledgeable than me would be able to explore that situation with far greater nuance. I can only give broad strokes, but it really shouldn't be a huge ask from a company with so much money and resource to tackle these subjects with at least some degree of care. The questing experience for Blood Elves in the Ghostlands would be somewhat similar to canon, but would involve a lot more of the political tension between bitter old enemies trying to find a path forward that doesn't result in more misery, and ultimately finding some kind of understanding as they push the Alliance and the Scourge out of their shared home. It's by no means all good and dandy by the end of the Zone story, but it would show the first step towards reparations and sow the seeds for future growth. In effect, that means there's no troll raid. We have evolved beyond murdering trolls every goddamn expansion, and I wish this trend had never started. It's tiresome. So instead we're going to let people play as forest trolls, because that would be neat. And yes, the racial mount for Imani would be the warbear, of course it would be. With that covered, we'll move on to the next video and the goings-on of Hellfire Peninsula.